Hey there, Ben Lawless here. Just want to do a quick video explaining to you what pairwise comparison is. Pairwise comparison is when you compare pairs of things to see which one's better. So in the context of developmental assessment, we compare two different criteria to see which one we think is more difficult. The idea being that our developmental rubric, or we can turn it into a progression, that the criteria we look at the relative difficulty of different criteria. So obviously you need to start off with a developmental rubric written according to the rubric writing rules developed at ARC. So here's an example of a historical one for a history assessment. Now what you'll note here is that students will think that everything at the first row, all this stuff, is equal difficulty. They'll think, yep, list facts is the same as writing incomplete sentences, same as history keywords. They'll think all this stuff's the same difficulty. Now, that is a very intuitive thing to assume. That's, the design of the rubric implies that the first box, the first row are all the same difficulty and so on. But that's not actually true. We know that difficulty goes up within each column, within each skill, within each indicator, but we're not saying that difficulty is the same across. So it's not true that the second criteria up is the same difficulty. So we're being misleading in the way that we show our rubrics, and there's a lot of benefits if we try to figure out the relative difficulty of different criteria, and it's actually surprisingly easy. The way that I was originally taught to do this at the Assessment Research Centre at Melbourne University is that you do it with post-it notes, and you stick all your criteria on the wall in post-it notes, and then you look at different criteria written on post-it notes and move your post-it note up or down. You can, I now pretty much just do it on Excel. So if I've got 2 or 3 people we're doing a pairwise comparison, I'll just project the rubric on a spreadsheet up onto a projector where we can all look at it, and then you can easily just move the text that's in each cell either up or down. It's a lot quicker than writing out hundreds of post-it notes for sure. So let's do a little example here. So here's our developmental rubric. We've got our 4 skills: knows content, empathizes, writes, and uses history terms and concepts. So we're going to put our little criteria along the bottom here. List facts, list things about soldiers. So now do I think that list facts and list things about soldiers are equal difficulty? Obviously, doing a pairwise comparison works really well when you're doing it with teachers who understand and have taught the material a lot. I've done enough history teaching to hopefully make some decent comments here. So I would say, yeah, listing facts and listing things about soldiers is roughly the same difficulty. It's both just listing some stuff. Okay. Writing incomplete sentences. So do I think that the students who can only list stuff rather than do anything better with it, are they the kinds of students who also write incomplete sentences? Yes, I think so. I reckon they're all about the same difficulty. What about this one here? Using history keywords. So these are using subject-specific keywords in their writing. Do I think that's the same difficulty as the other 3? No, I actually think it's a bit harder. So I'm going to move that up one. There we go. So now when students see this, they know that these 3 are the same difficulty, but using history keywords is a little bit harder. It's really good for their goal setting and stuff. Okay, so Eddie, we're going to lock those ones in, make them go white. That's just to signify that we've locked them in for now. Right, now I'm just putting back in the original criteria and then seeing whether they're harder or easier than the ones I've already put on this pairwise comparison rubric. So, describe specific details. Do I think that's the same difficulty as using history keywords? I think back to my experience of teaching this, and I think no, actually, there's a lot of students who can use the keywords, but they can't describe specific details. So I think that's even harder, and I'm going to move that one up there. What about describing how soldiers felt? Do I think that's about the same difficulty as using history keywords? Yeah, it's about the same. We'll keep that there. Writing clear sentences. This is a year 7 task, so I've found that year 7 students find writing clear sentences quite a bit harder. Now, just like to point out that I've probably broken one of the rubric writing rules with the word clear there. This word clear sentences is fairly ambiguous. So ideally I'll come up with a better criteria there. But anyway, like to keep it realistic with mistakes embedded. Anyway, so I think writing clear sentences is harder. I think it's about as hard as describing specific details, so I'm going to move it up to there. Yeah, you see why it's called a pairwise comparison, because we're looking at pairs of criteria. I compare clear sentences to history keywords. No, it's harder, and that's why I move it up. And my last one here, it started in the same place because that's where it was originally on our flat rubric, using cultural ideas. Obviously, cultural ideas can't be the exact same difficulty as history keywords, or I wouldn't have had it above it in the original rubric, so I'll move that one up there. Oh yeah, so now what I'm saying is, here we go, there's the first level, these are all roughly the same difficulty. Here's the second level, these are all roughly the same difficulty, and the third level up, these are all roughly the same difficulty. Nice. So you just keep doing that exact same process, comparing the criteria to what's already there, and make some judgments about what you think, how hard they are compared to the other ones. Now, it's a really good idea once you've done the whole thing. So here's an example of the finished pairwise. I would then go back again and have a look and think, oh, actually, no, I actually think that describing how soldiers felt is even harder than that. I might move it up one or whatever. Yeah. So you do the pairwise comparison with individual criteria, and then it's a really good idea right at the end to look at it all another time. I'll just quickly show you an example of a pairwise comparison in action. So this was one that I did for the Education Department here in Victoria, Australia. There's going left to right instead of up to down, so that might confuse you. You'll note that there's way more criteria on here than you'd have for one normal assessment task, but this was done with all of the criteria for the whole of the Year 12 performance descriptors. So I'm sitting here, there's a lot of thinking, there's a lot of me with my arms folded, sort of thinking how hard is that compared to something else, and you notice that I went back quite a few different times. So on this video here, so all the post-its there, that's the names of the skills, and all these other post-its are criteria. I've color-coded them just so that there's a different color in each row so I don't get too confused. So what I would be saying here, what the claim that I'm making with my little pairwise comparison is that everything in that row is all the same difficulty. Yeah, everything in that row are all the same difficulty. Everything in that row are all the same difficulty, and so on, right up to these two here are the hardest and of all of the criteria that were there. So that's what the doing a pairwise using post-its looks like. Now there's heaps of benefits. There's a lot of benefits for rubrics that have had a pairwise comparison done to them, as opposed to just a flat rubric. It's sort of, in terms of the terminology, you just call it a flat rubric if you want before you've done a pairwise. The process is called a pairwise comparison, but what you end up with afterwards is a hypothesized progression. It's called a hypothesized progression because you are hypothesizing the relative difficulty of different criteria. Yeah, you can back it up, you can actually validate it with data, but that's another story. So what are the benefits? And the benefits accrue to 4 different groups. So for the learners, a really, really important one, and I know this because I took some flat rubrics and put them on the whiteboard to my students, and I said, do you think that everything in the bottom row is all the same difficulty? Yes, we do. Do you think the ones that, next one up are all the same difficulty? Yes, we do. So students definitely think that criteria on the same row are the same difficulty, but they're not. So we're misleading them. So probably good not to do that. It also allows for much better goal setting. So if a student has been assessed at or self-assessed them at a certain level for a certain skill, then when the rubric has a pairwise comparison done on it, they can see other skills that are probably at the same level, and so they can aim for one above that or whatever. There's also lots of benefits for teachers. It supports targeted teaching. So you can, if you've assessed students who are at, the second row up on a pairwise comparison rubric, then you know that they're probably all ready for the similar next teaching intervention. A really, really surprising one, which we didn't grasp until we started doing this in practice, is that it's actually possible to kind of get a rough estimate of how good a student's going to be at a certain skill even before you've assessed them, right? If all of the skills are in the same domain, so say history-specific academic skills, and your pairwise is roughly right, then students who can do whatever skill are probably going to be at this whatever, on the same height. So that's really, really useful as well. For parents, I think I would argue that the reporting is easier to understand because it doesn't mislead anyone looking at the rubric into thinking that everything at the bottom row is the same difficulty. I would even go further to say that bringing in developmental rubrics, I think that you should jump straight to rubrics that have had a pairwise comparison applied to them, because there's enough effort explaining moving from a different form of assessment to one using developmental rubrics, and then to explain again why the format now has gaps, why there's blank cells. I reckon you should just go straight into the pairwise comparison. I mean, if writing a developmental rubric is hard, it's a lot harder than doing a pairwise comparison. So if you can write a developmental rubric, the pairwise comparison, if you're experienced enough to write a rubric in the first place, you'll be able to do the pairwise easy as. And finally, for leaders, they also get some benefits. It can help for them to see where their teaching resources might need to go. There are some challenges to this approach, obviously. Explaining the layout to rubric users if they're used to using the flat rubrics, and my suggestion would be to just jump straight into doing pairwise comparison. And obviously the other one is getting agreement from people who are so passionate and knowledgeable as teachers about the relative difficulty. But you generally find, I would recommend, if you're doing a pairwise comparison, to do it with maybe 2 or 3 teachers, not a bigger group than that. I would say that's about the same group size you'd want just for doing a rubric in the first place, 2 or 3 at most, and then show it to the wider teaching team if your teaching team's bigger than that, for their feedback. If you have 10 people all working on a rubric from scratch, or 10 people all trying to figure out the relative difficulty of 2 criteria, it's like herding cats. Anyway, so hopefully that went in some way to explaining the benefits of doing a pairwise comparison on your rubrics, so that you know the relative difficulty of different criteria, and then that means that you end up with a hypothesized progression. It's a progression that you, the skilled teacher, has hypothesized what the relative difficulty of those criteria are. Thanks a lot.